Hi, guys, and welcome to the State of It. We're here to discuss Ukraine and the current crisis that we're in. Dad is joining me from back home while I'm at uni. How are you feeling today, Dad? Feeling all right?
Tip top win, tip top.
Tip top. Sorry if the audio quality is a bit bad. We don't have our usual bells and whistles. I'm on a headset and my camera's not working, so it's going pretty badly on the Zoom call. But Dad, luckily, can be heard just fine. So, Dad, first question of the night. Has this conflict unfolded as you've predicted, or has it surprised you? Because I know a lot of people have been surprised by the resistance the Ukrainians have managed to put up in the past few days. They fought hard with tenacity. They prevented Kiev from being taken. They're holding, I can't pronounce it, Kharkiv. They've held that from a Russian onslaught. How has it played out in your eyes? Because I remember you talked to me and said you're not sure how long they can hold, but right now they seem to be doing just fine.
So look, the first thing is, you know, that have been predicting that Putin would invade Ukraine for the past months, and telegraph signals I think were really clear, and I'm amazed how they were misinterpreted. When British and US intelligence screamed loudly it was going to happen, I think it's a unique situation when they would be doing that from the top of president and prime minister level, and yet people still didn't listen. And I think what's that really demonstrates is, on the whole, human beings like to keep grazing on the grass whilst the wolf is just around the corner, and only at the last minute do they look up and realize the danger. There's a collective kind of response to that. In terms of the prognosis of how this has been progressing, um, I gave the Russians 10 days to complete an operation whereby the core administration would essentially surrender. And we are still a long way away from 10 days. That being said, I think the resistance that the Ukrainians have put up has been staggering. And it exposes all sorts of questions as to the combat capability of the Russian forces invading Ukraine, which we can talk of in detail. It definitely is an example of intention and heroism, but I think also there's an awful lot at play that we don't see, as the West detaches itself apparently from just its support of Ukraine, limiting boots on the ground. But I suspect there's an awful lot of intelligence feed going on at the moment through into the on the ground situation, which has meant the Ukrainian forces have been very successful in knowing where the main thrusts were coming from. That being said, a couple of days before I felt the invasion was imminent, took out a map of Ukraine and looked at the geographic features and thought a little bit about how Putin would think about it. And strange enough, every arrow I drew is exactly where there is a thrust, which is all around gaining the eastern part, east of the Dnieper, making sure you've got control of the western bank so you don't have to cross it in opposition, surrounding Kiev, making sure the coast is locked up. And that was what I call phase one of the operation. So my expectations are there. But that being said, I think Putin really is in trouble in terms of his expectation of moving in and swiftly, as we know, just riding in on a chariot and everyone giving him flowers and accepting it. And he's found himself in a really tricky situation. I think the Ukrainians they understood the attack was coming, so they must have pre-positioned their air assets. They had about 100 aircraft along motorways and able to fly. They had about 100 S-100, 300 systems, which are older than the S-400s that the Russian forces use. And they would have put those around the country in various key stops. They would have kept them in a no transmission mode, and at certain times turned them on, engaged the target, shot it down and popped away again, which created huge uncertainty for the Russians. That failure to get air superiority is the first, in my mind, like, how the hell has that happened? And why couldn't the Russians gain air superiority? Because a NATO force would have done that in a matter of hours and sustained it. So there's a real capacity gap there, which is fascinating.
Dad, just before you
I
go
also,
on, just before you go on, we'll come on to the situation on the ground very quickly. But to recap, you would say that you were not surprised the invasion actually happened, but you were surprised at the resistance that has come
yeah,
across
absolutely. How
from the
successful
Ukrainians.
the resistance has been in slowing down essentially the column's assaults on Kiev and in various places. It's been staggering. And I have to say that in a month of Sundays, I wouldn't have expected them to mount such a successful and coordinated series of constricting actions on the advance.
Based on the intelligence from the US and UK that both were pointing towards an invasion, do you still think that the leaders of NATO were surprised that there was an invasion, or do you think that they were in fact prepared weeks in
I
advance?
think our political leaders were surprised. I think anyone plugged into the military intelligence that must have been coming down the pipe, and especially I think the UK intelligence led the charge publicly, at least, was aware that this wasn't any kind of exercise, barring preparations for an invasion. And the things that I think should have alerted people was the live firing exercises taking place in the weeks beforehand. If you look at what happened in Iraq, for example, our forces were operating live firing exercises and then stopped them and immediately commenced their operations, which is exactly what we saw with Russia, and something that the moment you understood they were building in field hospitals, which are not part of exercise mechanisms, they were live firing along the terrain, building their combat capability up, and then they launched their attack. It's even more staggering that after some combat workup for effectiveness, they've really had these troubles, which suggests it's not the actual Russian forces themselves, it's actually the interdictions of the Ukrainians. And I can only assume that they've had a policy of understanding the axis of thrust, using key choke points or crossroads to slow down the advance. And meanwhile, their forces are actually well behind the back of the column, aiming for the logistics. And that logistical impact would have been huge on fuel and the facility of the column to actually continue, slowing the whole process down. And at the same time, I think the javelins that the UK gave the Ukrainians, 2,000 javelins is really not an insignificant number. And I suspect a fair portion of the takeouts of tanks and armored vehicles would have been a portion to that. So I'm sure Putin doesn't consider Britain his favorite country at the moment.
I'm not sure he's a fan of anyone in Europe right now, but
But I think
moving.
he's
Sorry, go on.
especially got a little spot in his heart that says "Get Britain."
But now, I mean, there are countries like Germany and France, even Finland. Finland is so close to Russia's border; it's now sending weaponry to Ukraine in quite large quantities. Would that not redirect Russian anger towards its neighbours
Well,
rather than us?
I think what's really fascinating is, if the Ukrainians had rolled over, it would have been a fait accompli in 3 days, and NATO would have been faced with the terrible dilemma of where else is Putin going to strike, Finland or anywhere where there was a weakness in the system. The Ukrainians have done not only their own country and themselves the most incredible service by their bravery, they've also done NATO and the EU a huge service, because by their resistance and preventing that fait accompli, they've acted as a coalescing agent to suddenly galvanize so many of these countries like Germany that in effect were in appeasement mode and actually are responsible for this very problem because they didn't create the effective deterrence, and also hold Britain responsible because we didn't invest in defense. It was one thing to migrate the EU further east, but not to do it when we lowered our defensive capabilities, which we've done systematically thanks to a whole decade's worth of politicians. So the Ukrainians have woken the rest of Europe up to their danger. The rest of Europe understand that if the battle isn't won in Ukraine, it'll be fought again somewhere closer to their soil. So it's galvanized everyone with a common purpose. And that must truly shock Putin, who thought he would repeat the Crimea exposure, run in and it would all be over. And then, the West was left to dislodge him. This is completely different. And in his miscalculation is a huge problem, because Putin really can't lose in his own mind, because if he loses this war, he loses his leadership. He knows he won't survive. So this isn't a war fought with the impunity of knowing that if Russia can retreat and he'll still be in one piece. This is an all-out conflict for him. And I think, you asked about what's about to happen next, is this delaying function of delaying the main columns moving into Kiev has been obviously very successful. I think we can assume that some of the Russian soldiers that, interesting enough as conscripts, they have to basically sign a document before they can go overseas on operations. And we've heard rumors of some 5,000 troops possibly refusing to do that en masse, and they may account for some of the forces of the 190,000 that haven't actually come into the Ukraine. They've actually refused. So I'd like to know more details about that. But essentially, now the forces are deploying around Kiev. The expectation is once there is a ring and they're surrounded and locked in, that there would be a peace process, and the peace process has just finished. And that for Putin was basically to say, well, I did offer you surrender, you didn't do it, so it's your fault. What comes next? Because what does come next really concerns me, and that is we haven't seen the use of Russian heavy artillery, which is of a considerable capability, whether it's thermobaric weapons, which really create a large sort of low overpressure by spraying a mist of petroleum, which you ignite and it sucks all the air out, but it creates this low overpressure that goes into buildings, or whether they're using 103mm heavy guns and their artillery en masse to destroy blocks. We're about to see that unleashed on the Russian population, on the Ukrainian population, and Putin can say in his own little mind, essentially how he gave them a choice and they didn't accept. So I think tonight and the next 24 hours is going to be really hellish. Whatever we have seen is just a frightening tidbit of what's about to be unleashed. And Putin would do all he can to bring about the surrender of Kiev and the breaking of the morale of the Ukrainian people. Now, I also think,
Dad, why would he not use these weapons? Why would he not use them in the initial advance to crush Ukrainian resistance?
So up until now, he has been deploying to surround Kiev, and these heavy weapons wouldn't have worked against the tactics I suspect the Ukrainians have been using. The interesting thing is how, well, in effect, they've been very precise about attacking locations, rear support columns of logistical areas. They've lain in wait, I suspect, as the column's gone past. They've been really smart about what they've done, and the Russians weren't configured or adaptive enough to get around that. But obviously, they managed to get enough forces through that initial blocking technique to now deploy in the ring around Kiev. And now that ring is about to tighten. And with that tighten, if he's ever going to use his heavy forces, he's going to use them right now. And they're artillery, thermobaric weapons, and I fear there is a risk of chemical weapons, because they would be extremely effective at removing many people in a city who are resisting without masks and suitable NBC gear. So there's a risk that he does do that too. And there are, as far as I can see, no holds barred for Putin in what is a fight for his very life in his own perception and reality.
Paint us a picture. What does the situation look like, both militarily on the ground in Ukraine and politically in the world, in a week's time from now, in your opinion?
Well, it depends. So let's just assume option one, Kiev falls. I don't really think that Ukraine is going to give up when anyone's still left breathing anywhere.
Do you think that if it had been taken quickly, the resistance would have been crushed, but because it's been prolonged, they've had time to arm themselves and build momentum?
Everyone's really got their blood up. They've seen people they love die. They've seen atrocities. They've been inspired by their heroes, and there are some incredibly heroic stories which are deeply moving to hear, of men that have given their lives, and women, I would presume, to save others and to slow down the Soviet advance. It's a story of legend, and it's now etched in the Ukrainian conscious. So they're going to fight till the last for their land. And Putin, even if he takes Ukraine, and even if he's successful in eradicating an incredibly heroic and brave president, he just becomes a martyr. So now he's got a problem, because the longer this goes on, the longer his casualties mount up, the harder it is to really articulate what he was doing in his plan to the Russian people, which I don't think he's told the truth to by a large degree. So the undercurrent of resistance in society increases. They're suffering through the sanction process increases. Of all the sanctions, I think are the most impressive. It's basically freezing all the central bank's assets of Russia, because they had some $680 billion in a war chest that I think Putin thought was going to make him or give him the isolation from any sanctions.
And now
suddenly forgot the fact.
Well, Switzerland today as well.
Money was left in Western banks, which is just an absolute classic, because Russians have become so used to using London as their bank and Europe as their bank, they never thought the doors would close. So there's an irony in that action. I think that's probably the most significant action, because again, it means time isn't on Putin's favor. He's got to have a quick outcome. He's got to bring to resolution, because time, money, war costs money, all of those dynamics are working against him. So that's why I think he's going to be increasingly aggressive.
So you think he'll be more desperate in the next week, politically more aggressive, lashing out towards other countries?
I think the escalation in the next week is going to really be frightening. Simply because as he doesn't get what he wants in the combat zone, and I can see that the Russian forces probably are questioning why they're going through this and the processes that they're enduring, there is a risk that he employs a tactic which he signed off on, which is called nuclear de-escalation. It's essentially the concept: use a small nuclear weapon somewhere to knock the stuffing out of your enemy and shock them. And because Ukraine sits outside NATO, because it has no response, My really biggest concern is he uses that tactic, and then we're faced with a weapon, small weapon, but a nuclear weapon, inverted commas, deployed within Ukraine in the west, probably somewhere in one of the supply lines where Western supplies are coming through, and we are left all just completely staggered that he would be prepared to do that. Then it's a question whether Ukrainians keep fighting and the escalations that go with that. So I think it's going to get really pretty hairy as we go through the next week, because you're moving into almost a territory of the Cuban Missile Crisis and a standoff somewhere along the way. And I think that's really the only concept that brings us to an end, because the West can't affect apart from trying to win in Ukraine, but that brings about secondary effects. So, what is your strategy if you're sitting in a war room right now? You recognize that essentially Putin is surrounded by a cadre of people that are fundamentally loyal and unquestioning to his cause. The Navalny revolution attempt not long ago would have removed any of the people that felt like they could stand up. And so, relatively speaking, you're kind of a polarized group of people around Putin. And so you're going to have to really raise the threshold of human indecency and damage and structure to get one of those people to trigger, or a number to trigger, the fact that they can't sit with a leader taking the right course. So it's like ratcheting up the internal pressure in actually a very loyal group of people. And to try and describe the magnitude of the problem, if you go and look at what happened into the 1945 collapse of Nazi Germany in Berlin, those loyal people never turned on them, even though the world was collapsing around them. And that's partly because the Valkyrie operation, which was the bomb plot, obviously, at his lair, didn't work, and thousands of people who were suspicious, or who the Gestapo were suspicious of being anti-Hitler, were removed. So the genesis and the fertility of any action disappeared. So I think we've got a pretty high threshold inside Putin's cadre, which means this is going to get very, very uncomfortable, not just for the Ukrainians, but for the whole of the Western world, as we see the brinkmanship ratchet up to levels that may not be much different from Cuba.
And what do you think of the situation militarily? Do you think the key cities will fall and the Ukrainians will be pushed back west? Do you think the south will fall first? Because the southern push right now seems to be very strong. They're about to link up. The Russians are about to link up to the eastern front and
So I
start
think
the
one of the
encirclement properly.
so effectively I wrote about this process as they've created the encirclement strategy of taking the whole of the East Ukraine. And at the moment, the Ukrainians don't have the mobility to move, or ability, so they're caught in an encirclement like the Falaise Gap and off the D-Day beaches, which is going to be pretty horrendous. They're going to keep fighting. They're not going to surrender. So there's encirclement taking place in the eastern part of Ukraine, east of the Dnieper, and there's encirclement in Kiev. I think that Putin thinks that by the time you've removed the resistance predominantly in the east and Kiev collapses, he's in a good shape. Now, I don't think he can stop there. West is going to carry on resisting. It's where the Ukrainian speakers are. The East is obviously where the 6, 7, 8 million indigenous Russian speakers are. But he's got a problem of the flow of arms, and the people in the West are not going to stop fighting. So he's now got to go and deal with the West, which is why I always thought it would be a two-phase operation. And he may be even more brutal to the people who don't speak Russian, because there is no ethnic bond. So I just can't see how this suddenly changes or stops. It's going to be really, really horrible. And my heart goes out to the Ukrainian people in ways I just don't know how to articulate. And I do feel particularly angry, if I'm honest, about, my work has been about warning that this is the peak of the commodity cycle, and this was the age of conflict. And I've been warning about it ever since I identified it back in 2002. Breaking the Code of History is exactly about that, about warning this was at this particular time. And from my efforts with Now or Never and a defense review in the last review that was essentially moving forward rather than backwards, I think that Britain had a particularly key role as a key member of Europe, one of the two main, spenders on defense, that it didn't sufficiently spend enough money to deter Putin's aggression. And we've had plenty of cases where we've had submarine incursions, plane incursions, where we've had poison released in Salisbury, which in the old Cold War era was a weapon of mass destruction that demanded a serious, retaliation. May didn't do that. So we are responsible for facilitating someone and preventing the appropriate deterrence of his intentions and military actions. This isn't an accidental war. Yes, he's the aggressor, but we didn't learn the lessons of history. And the only thing I can take solace with is the speed at which Europe is uniting. But this is also one incident. If we manage to get through this with Russia, we've still got to get through this process with China. And so it's the beginning of a drawn out, as I call it, age of war, rather than just a one-off event, which is exceptionally significant and has a precipice involved. But we're really on in some very difficult times. And Britain, for example, should have already announced, and I believe should have used as a deterrent, a commitment to raising defense to 5%, because we have a minuscule capability to defend ourselves. Right now, we're relying on the American missile shield, which can't protect against a full-on nuclear attack, but can protect against limited incursions by missiles in the 5s and 10s, which prevents and raises the threshold for Putin's strategic or his nuclear process of de-escalation. We didn't have to do that. We could have armed our Type 45 destroyers with ballistic missile capable radars and missiles, and we could be doing that independently, and they would be adding to us rather than we're reliant. So I think our leaders and our defense ministers, although they may be responding right now, have in fact blood on their hands for failing to learn the lessons of history that was screaming right in front of them. And for that, I am really, really sad. And I just hope now we don't just increase defense spending, but we move it to a wartime level, because essentially we're at war with Russia. Putin will see us at war. We may think the distinction is there are no soldiers on the ground, but we provide intelligence, weapons, probably special forces, and really there isn't much difference. So we need to think like we are at war, we are being attacked, and there's still another power out there that's vastly more powerful than Russia, waiting behind the wings to see how we react. So as I described in some of my updates, and I often think about Tolkien's work that was written before war broke out, there's a scene where they talk about the doom of our time. And that's exactly what we are in now, the doom of our time, and only strength and intention and coordination is going to get us through this, to hopefully somehow find a way through this with Russia, and certainly deter this bigger monster on the hill, which is China, which is still waiting for us behind this.
Well, you are on a lovely vein of thought there that I was going to come to now, so it's good. You seem to think that if Putin loses this war, he will be deposed through a coup and unpopularity, which I can see. But can you just paint a brief, just in summary, a scenario where Ukraine falls within the next week? What does the world look like in a few sentences?
Well, so Ukraine falls. I don't think falls the right word, because
Well, is
I see it
occupied or gets taken?
okay, so it may be occupied, a puppet government. Then there will be ongoing resistance. Then we are in an absolute breathtaking arms race, where our
Well,
national
Germany's already
resources,
started rearming, which is incredible,
yeah,
given that they
but
have a
it
tradition
is.
to not do that.
Well, they've literally almost worse than us. They've denuded themselves of any defense capability, so they're naked towards aggression. It isn't about spending money. It's about spending huge amounts of money with delivery times that are wartime type programs. So either way this works, we need to be on a wartime rearmament program that has really short deliveries to increase combat capability. It is the number one focus of this nation from now on, and for every nation in the EU has to be this process, because we're talking about the greatest threshold time in terms of the cycles of commodities. We're talking about China will make its move within 2 years. It will try and make its move on Taiwan, in my opinion, in any gap that's left through this Ukraine crisis. At the moment, it's probably very quiet, because the risk of a Cuban crisis and a full nuclear exchange includes it on the target database by both sides, I suspect. So its interest is to quell this down, and it's probably got the same conundrum that the Western leaders have: is how do you get Putin
How do you
to
calm
back
him
off?
down once he's started going? Because they seem quite neutral
Exactly
right
right,
now, but they
and yeah,
don't seem amazingly supportive either.
well, no, their job is to sort of sit a bit. I'm sure that they are looking at the disaster scenario that includes them, and they're not trying to inflame any part of it, quite rightly. But if you come off the disaster scenario, then you're moving into the next phase of when they choose to move into Taiwan. They have a real problem in that, just imagine if Putin loses, which we can only hope he does, his replacement is almost inevitably going to be pro-Western, in which case, by being pro-Western, it's anti-Chinese. It surrounds China because now you have its northern borders. It doesn't give them the commodities they need. And all of a sudden, China finds itself in a very different strategic position. So from that construct, Beijing has got this butterfly, which is on the one side, let's avoid all-out nuclear war, which includes us. On the other side is we can't really let Russia lose, because if we do, we lose our key ally and we become literally surrounded and constricted.
Will
So
that
they've
make
got
them
a
more
tricky
desperate,
road
like
to try.
Putin right now, like a rat in a corner that starts to
Well,
fight more?
Putin is a man possessed or a rat possessed, without doubt. They are much more calculating, and because their force is really quite powerful and is only becoming powerful, they don't have to do anything precipitous. They're a far more stable bunch. Although the question of dictatorships, putting the hands of the whole planet in their hands in a single person thought process, I think probably is going to undermine the concept of dictatorship for years to come after this. So I wonder whether Xi might be vulnerable himself by the Politburo that wonders whether he might be another Putin. So there are all sorts of throw-off aspects, which I think are destabilizing for China. Right now, it's facing a number of strategic issues it didn't think it would.
What are your thoughts on the European response? Because I've got to be honest, we've seen in the past few days of Europe more united in a cause than we have in a very long time. Is it the old adage of once you have an enemy to focus on, you unite behind each other despite the divides that existed before?
Yes, I think it absolutely is. It's in the case of Germany, it's fear for its own future, and there's a sense of guilt as it realizes its appeasement has been thoroughly responsible for where we are now. Germany's disablement by Angela Merkel and her policies have been stunning. And the realization that those policies have led to the encouraging of Putin's aggression and now threaten Germany, and the buffer zones in front of them has woken them up with a frightening start. So they're almost overcompensating for their errors and trying to retune themselves into a different mode. But it's also about survival. So I think it's also the sense of humanity, which is collective. I think the reality that we are no different than our ancestors. Just because it's 2022, underlying human behavioral patterns are exactly the same, and they're ones which I've been highlighting, that basically dictatorial expansive states are predatory, and the moment you give them the space to launch themselves upon you, they will do it, and the only protection you have is a deterrence whereby they doubt the success of their assault. And we have failed that lesson, and the EU is actually pretty guilty because it's been migrating east. And it has, disrespected the original construct of Russia and its sense of security. So, I'm not going to justify in any way what Putin's done, but we've done nothing to basically to de-risk the fundamental insecurities of Putin's perspective of Russia. And we've also made it worse, because if you choose to expand and accept democratic peoples of the East joining, then you should have made sure that you could defend them sufficiently against a change of mind in Russia. And we watched him rearm, develop new systems, become aggressive, change his strategic and tactical operations, probe our defenses with aggressive reconnaissance by submarines and aeroplanes, none of which it can only be interpreted as very hostile, more hostile than we ever saw in the Cold War, funnily enough. So the signals were all there that we ignored, and I find that really, really upsetting, because as you know, I've been trying to explain to people the risk and warned, and it's been like dealing with a sleeping people who just can't see it. But at least now they've woken up. The question is, they need to go even further than they think they need to go to compensate for what comes next in terms of China. And obviously, to get through this crisis right now is very immediate.
What do you think of Turkey's response? As a country that is essentially ruled by a fellow dictatorial ruler, their response to throw their lot in with NATO in a very stark way by closing the Bosphorus recently is an interesting decision.
They didn't actually close it, and if they did, it would probably be an act of war. So they didn't.
They closed it to Russian warships.
No, they didn't. They can't.
They
didn't
though.
Do it, actually. Well, I think I want to double check. I don't think they did, because I did actually go and look it after we discussed it.
Well, now I'm doubting myself.
I love you dearly, but I think
did.
You should. No, we're to hear a lot more about it. Trust me. Look, I think you got to remember that Turkey was a NATO power before this, but I think it sits on the Black Sea with the potential of even more Russian influence, and it doesn't want to be on the receiving end. It has also a little bit of an ironic situation because Erdogan's rule has some similarities to Putin's. and I'm going to leave that right now. But nonetheless, I'm glad to say it's thrown a lot in, and it's an important ally. It's a strong military force sitting on the eastern borders, and that's, I think, really good news that it's done that, and NATO has become thoroughly melded and integrated. And I think once, hopefully, we get through this crisis, I think the Chinese will realize they're not dealing with a NATO that's insipid and has lost its sense of perspective. It's a fully mobilized agency to protect itself, and by extension, as it becomes stronger, other countries further afield, I suspect.
Fantastic. I think you're right. Apparently they haven't closed the Bosphorus, but BBC reported that they did. So I
It's
got
really
very
good to know you can do two
confused.
things at once, my son.
I can do two things at once. I just got confused by the reporting there. That was a bit annoying. That's very awkward, isn't it? Oh God.
I got to
I
say,
would,
when you mentioned it to me, I did have a massive amount of indigestion as I worked through the implications, and then
that'd be a bit awkward.
Sarah said, "Why don't you look it up
Oh,
and
that's
see whether it actually
very
happened?"
annoying. They were. Oh, good God, I've been done quite dirty by the reporting.
You owe me indigestion over one meal for
Oh,
that.
crap. Apologies. All right. Well, that's all we have time for today, Dad. Thank you so much, and thank you for enlightening us with your forecasting.
Well, it's great to be back on the road with you, Win. I think in the days ahead, we should just keep updating people, because it's important to understand what's ahead. And I think it's going to get very, very unpleasant for all of us. And I think in the end, we have to truly not just hope, but also believe that ultimately human nature in extremis will prevail. Somewhere in that Putin regime, there is someone whose conscience is waking up, who knows they can't carry on if they wish to see their nation survive in its current form. So we just hope that person or groups of people are able to act at the right moment.